How do you fill out your pilot's logbook? No matter whether you're working towards a specific license or rating, if you fly privately or commercially, every pilot should log their flights. But how do you do it? When should you do it? And isn't the paper logbook like this outdated? Let's find out. Let's start with how you fill out your logbook, because that's probably why you clicked on this video. So when we open the logbook, on the very first page, there's some space to write down your name and your license number, if you already have it. This serves to identify who this logbook belongs to and correspondingly whose entries these are. This is usually followed by some space where you can write down your address, which again serves for identification, but also in case you lose it, whoever finds it can send it back to you. On the next couple of pages, many logbooks have some space to write down your medical checks, your class ratings, type ratings, and so on, which is great as an overview, but it's not mandatory that you fill it out. Because if you apply for a job or if you have a ramp check, they will anyway ask for the original documents. But I find it very useful as just a general overview. Next up, many logbooks have some pages outlining how you should fill out your logbook, which is essentially what we're covering in this video in hopefully a slightly more understandable way. So we'll just skip these pages and dive straight in. Once you have your logbook open, the actual logging part of your logbook should look like this. This is the standard format for most EASA and FAA recognized logbooks. So no matter which logbook you have, this video will apply to you as well. In the first column, you write down the date when your flight took place. This is quite obvious. You write down the day of the month, and also the year. Now, importantly, this is the date of departure, meaning that if you have a flight overnight, starting in the evening, ending in the next morning, you write down the evening when you took off. Speaking of the departure, the second column is about the departure airport and the departure time. Now, when it comes to the airport, you essentially have two options. Either you can use the 3-letter IATA code if the airport has one, but since most smaller airfields don't have one of these, I prefer writing down the 4-letter ICAO code. This is a unique identifier for each and every airport on this planet, and it also encodes some information about the continent and the country where the airport is located. So I find it a bit more useful than the IATA code. And especially if you're a private pilot, then you're probably flying to airports that don't have a IATA code anyway. When it comes to the departure time, this is actually not the time when you take off, but the off-block time, meaning as soon as the aircraft starts moving under its own power. In other words, once you start taxiing, that's your off-block time. So how to write down the off-block time? That's usually down with 2 numbers indicating the hour and 2 numbers indicating the minutes. So 12:30 would be 1230, for example. Another thing to consider here is that usually you write down the times in UTC or Zulu time. Now, if you're only flying locally, then it doesn't really matter that much, and you can also write it down in local time. Just make sure to be consistent, but this becomes quite important as soon as you start crossing time zones, because otherwise it can really get confusing. And if you write down the times in UTC, it just makes life so much easier. Column 3 is very similar, except that this time we're talking about the arrival. So you write down where you've landed at and at what time. But again, this is not the time when you touched down on the runway, but your on-block time, meaning as soon as you come to a full stop in the parking position, that's the time you write down. Next up, in column 4, we have the aircraft you've flown. Here you first write down what make or model or variant you've flown. In my case, that would be a Diamond Katana, which has the unique identifier Delta Victor 20. I also fly a Piper Warrior with the identifier Papa 28 Alpha. Each aircraft has one of these unique identifiers, which you'll put there. Beneath that, you write down the registration of your aircraft, so we don't just know what type of aircraft you've flown, but also exactly which one. And importantly here, usually you have a dash between your country identifier and then the aircraft identifier. For example, in Switzerland, you have the country identifier Hotel Bravo, followed by 3 letters identifying the aircraft, and they're separated by a dash. Now, when you write down the registration here in the logbook, you omit this dash in the middle and just write everything in one single word. Moving on to column 5, here you specify whether you were the sole pilot or whether this was a multi-pilot operation. In this section, you also specify whether you've flown a single-engine aircraft or a multi-engine aircraft. Now, to make clear whether you flew single-engine or multi-engine as a single pilot or with a multi-pilot crew, you simply write down your total flight time in the corresponding column. Now again, the total flight time here is your off-block to your on-block time. Not actual departure to landing, but from moving the aircraft to stopping the aircraft. Essentially, the difference of what you've written down in columns 2 and 3. So how to write down the times in these columns? As you can see in my logbook, each of these columns is kind of subdivided again into 2 parts. In the first sub-column, you write down the hours, and in the second sub-column, you write down the minutes. In column 6, you specify the total time of the flight. During normal operations as a private pilot, this is usually the same time as what you've written down in column 5. In column 7, you write down the name of the pilot in command. Now, if you're a private pilot flying by yourself, then you are the pick and you write down your name. You can also write down self to make clear that you are the pilot in command in this case. However, as a student pilot, unless you're doing a solo flight, you will write down the name of your instructor, because even though you're flying, he's technically the pilot in command. And there's some additional things to consider when you have a multi-pilot crew, which are outlined in the beginning of the logbook. In column 8, you write down the number of landings you did at day or during the night. Very simple. If you did only 1 landing, you write down 1 landing. If you did 2 or 3 or 10, then you write that the corresponding number. In column 9, you specify the operating conditions during which the flight took place. The default assumption is that you did a VFR flight during the day. But if you did a night VFR flight or a flight under IFR conditions, you will write down how much of the total time took place under these conditions. This can be the entire total time or only part of it, and then you write that down here. In column 10, you specify the function you had as a pilot during this flight. If in column 7 you wrote down your own name as pilot in command, then you will also add your flight time in the pick column of this section. If you are a multi-pilot crew and you were the co-pilot, then you would write that down correspondingly in the co-pilot column. Now, as a student pilot, if your instructor is sitting next to you, you write down your time in the dual column, and vice versa. If you're an instructor currently instructing a student pilot, you can also write the time down you spent as an instructor. And then column 12 is for any remarks and endorsements that you might have. Since I'm doing my private pilot license at the moment, I write down the number of each flight lesson and what we did during that lesson. But you can also write down other things. For example, if you have a remark on the weather conditions that were particularly challenging or interesting, if you did a familiarization training or difference training, then you can write that down. If your instructor wants to write an endorsement, he can also write that down there. That's a column where you can write down whatever you want. Now, once you've filled an entire page of your logbook, the time comes to sum up all of the columns. First, sum up the times on this page to get a total for that page. Then you write this down in this first row where it says total this page, again for every column where you've written something. Once you did that, you also count the total of all of the previous pages in every column where you have something written. You write that down in the second row, and then as a last step, you calculate your new total time or your new total number of landings by summing up these 2 rows and writing it down in the bottom row. To make life easier, you can then already transfer your new total time and your new total number of landings onto the next page in the second row where it says total previous pages. And like that, you will just continue summing up all of your times and all of your landings, so you always have a broad overview of how much total time you have. And lastly, once a page is fully filled out, in the bottom right corner, you will have to sign the logbook entries to certify that all of the logs are true. Now, those of you who paid close attention will have noticed that I skipped one column. I jumped immediately from column 10 to column 12. That is because in my logbook, column 11 is moved to the back of the logbook into a separate section. Column 11 is about simulator time, and it works essentially in the same way as you would log your flight time. You again have a column 1 to write down the date. Then in column 11, you specify the type of simulator and whether you were a trainee or an instructor or an examiner. And you also have a column 12 to write down any remarks or endorsements. And really in the exact same way as with the normal logbook entries, once one page is completely filled out, you sum everything up, add that to your previous total, and then you get a new total time for the sim session. And it's not a coincidence that I'm holding a pen while explaining all of this to you, because that's what you should use when filling out your logbook. You shouldn't use anything that can be erased, so no pencils, but also none of these pilot friction markers. They can be erased by friction and they can be erased by heat. So if you leave your logbook on the dash of your car on a hot summer day, chances are that your logbook entries will be gone when you come back. So use a pen. It would be very sad if you lost all of your entries because of that. Now that we know how to fill out the logbook, when should you do it? I would say the best time is immediately after each flight. But if that's not feasible because you have multiple legs on the same day, then just fill it out at the end of the very last leg. It's as simple as that. But the question remains, should you still use a paper logbook or isn't that outdated? Shouldn't you go digital? Personally, I chose the paper logbook for 3 different reasons. First of all, I got this from my flight school, and as a student pilot on the way to getting my private pilot license, it's actually mandatory that you write down everything on paper. So I didn't really have a choice to begin with. But even if I had, and even after getting my PPL, I will continue using my paper logbook for another 2 reasons. Reason number 2 is that you can collect stamps from airports that you've flown to, or you can use special colors for special events. For example, I wrote down my first ever solo flight with a red pen instead of my normal blue pen, so it would immediately pop out when I flip through the pages. Your instructor can write down endorsements and so on. These are all things that you cannot do with an electronic logbook. And point number 3 kind of goes along with this. It's just nice to have something you can flip through and look back on memories, because each flight for me is associated with a special memory, and by flipping through the pages and kind of seeing the stamps and the endorsements and where we've been to kind of all brings back these memories, which I think gets lost a bit in an electronic logbook. Now, when you choose a paper logbook, you have several options. Personally, I use the official logbook from the Swiss Civil Aviation Authority, the BOTSL, in English called FOCA. But otherwise, the Jeppesen logbooks are also a very good choice. Both of them conform with EASA regulations, and so if you want to apply for an airline job, for example, this will do the trick. If you prefer digital solutions, you have an integrated logbook in ForeFlight, or there's dedicated websites such as Caps Log Aero, where you can log your flights digitally. Both solutions have their pros and cons, so in the end, I think it's a matter of personal preference. But regardless whether you use a paper logbook or whether you use a digital solution, I think you should really back up your entries. Why should you do so? In case of paper logbook, it might get stolen, you might lose it, it might get lost during an accident, who knows? But there's always the chance of losing this thing, and you don't want to lose your logbook entries with it. Similarly, an app might crash, data might be hacked or stolen, you might forget your login, and then you don't have access to your data anymore. So even with digital solutions, things can happen. It would be very sad if you lost all of your flight hours because of something like that. So how can you back up your logbook? If you're using a paper logbook, one option would be to use a digital solution as a backup. For example, if you're already using ForeFlight for navigation, you have the logbook part included in your plan, and you can just also add your entries there. You can also transfer all of your entries to an Excel spreadsheet, or you can take pictures of your logbook and upload it to the cloud, be it a Google Drive or iCloud or whatever you're using. But now I'm curious, what solution do you prefer? Digital or paper? And how do you back up your data? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you liked this video and see you in the next one. Bye!